looks like we have most everybody on the call.
Mm-hmm. I believe this was the only subcommittee out of my 4 that we had. We didn't have folks who had to miss, so that's a great thing.
It is. I'll go ahead and let you put the slides up then.
Okay.
And I'll call them in order.
I'm actually going to share. It's going to be my whole screen to start with, but I'll slide it over. It's just so that we can also get to that Google Drive. But then I'll unshare and share again when we really get rolling.
Okay, perfect. Because if you don't mind, Jamie, I'll let you be the one that reads the preemptive stuff when we get started, you know, like the car commercial disclaimer.
Sure. The speed read.
Yes.
Okay. Can anybody, everybody see my screen? Can you see it, Janet? I think you're the only one I can see. Okay.
Can everyone else see it?
Yep. So welcome everyone. As Janet just said, a cold day here in East Tennessee, but some sunshine over on the middle and west end. So happy December, and it's here. We are really excited about today. It's going to definitely be a whirlwind of a meeting. We have an awful lot jam-packed into today. I'm going to quickly show you how to access your feedback. The feedback that you're going to see in the slide deck today is actually more of a, think of it as a summary of the high-level trends. So, and those high-level trends are going to spark conversation for you all today based around the components of a student-based funding formula. There are 4 parts, 4 components. And so the slide deck actually follows each of those components. Janet will run you through that. We'll tag team just a little bit here and there, but basically I want you to think about that as kind of your high level trends or a summary level of feedback. However, you do have a smaller grain size. You have individual feedback. I sent an email out. Oh my goodness, what is today? Thursday, was it maybe Monday night or Tuesday night? I can't remember. But I sent out an email to all subcommittee members just alerting them that your feedback is in the Google Drive. So I'm going to show you where that is. I had a lot of requests from folks to say, can you help walk us through it? So I'm just going to take less than 2 minutes and show you where. So this is our Google Drive. I'll drop that back in the chat again, but don't forget it is in your invite, your calendar invite. It's the second. Actually, sorry. Yes, it is. It will be the second link in your calendar invite. I'll drop it in the chat as well, but this is what it looks like. You have a subfolder for every meeting. Meeting number 3 today, you're going to see you have all this information. Of course, you always have the PowerPoint and the agenda, but along with that are resources that were loaded last week. And you are charged to kind of look through these and really review them to kind of sharpen your blade a little bit before we get back in January. You'll also see, as requested, there are the funding formulas for a few other states. There's Maryland, Ohio, and I believe down here, yes, is Texas. You also have a resource link page. Although this is all sent to you in an email, we've decided to put it in the Google Drive for easy access, but this resource link page, all you have to do is click on the blue hyperlink and it'll give you quick access to lots of resources that answer many of the questions that were asked before. So if I go back to here, that was meeting number 3 for today, but you have a new folder called public comments, the one right here that's highlighted. So if you click on public comments, you have 2 documents kind of hanging out here. You have the instructions and overview document that basically just tells you kind of how to, the procedure you can use to kind of look through this. Then you also have a tracker, which I'll go ahead and open it up. As you'll see, it's just a spreadsheet. In column A right here, you have a unique identifier. This basically just corresponds to an actual document, a PDF document that is in that comment PDFs folder that's back in right here, this one right here. So it just, it correlates to one of those documents. So if we wanted to see Document number 3 is from Angela Tuttle, and it was an email. If you scroll on down, you'll start to see that there's some from events. There are letters, all kinds of stuff. So there are 106 documents that are in that in this folder right here, comment PDFs. And then you're going to see that we have, or I'm sorry, 107. I'll get it right eventually, I promise. But then you'll see that starting with 108, it's actually public town hall. And then here you go with commentary. So if you keep on scrolling down, you'll see the commentary over in the far right column. So that's basically how you use the tracker. But let's go back to the PDFs. Here you go with PDFs. There have been a couple folks email me and say they can't get this to work. Then there are other people who say if I do the right click and then download, that once they download, they can actually get the document. For those that can't open it up, just know that we are troubleshooting on our end to see how we can get you a workaround for that. Some people can actually see them all already. I'm like a lot of people, I'm kind of a hybrid. I have some that are showing up and I have some that are not. So do not worry about, purchasing anything extra to view it or anything else on your end, but know that you can right click download and see if it works for you. If not, we're troubleshooting, and as soon as we have a workaround, we'll let you know. So that is where your public comments are that are smaller grain size, individual, or as you saw in the tracker, more of a commentary from town halls. So I'm going to pause right there and see if anybody has any questions.
Jamie, just a quick point to make, if I could.
Sure.
Our group is maintaining a Google Drive just with resource documents and working documents. And so that link, a shortcut link to this department's Google Drive is, I think, the first one in the first thing in the drive. So I know it's confusing keeping 2 drives and going back and forth. So I placed that alias link to the funding engagement page in our working drive.
That's super. Thank you so much. Yeah, there's always a level of confusion when it comes to Google Drive. I think it's just inherent, but that'll work. So the last thing I want to show you before I turn it over to Janet is if you happen to have to miss one of our meetings, this is where you'll find recordings. I'll drop this in the chat as well. It's just tn.gov/education, and this is our TN EDU funding page. So if you scroll down, you'll see that all the subcommittees are listed here. And what you'll do is you'll click on our subcommittee, and you'll see for each meeting, we populate the actual PowerPoint and the agenda and the recording. There are also a list of dates, and if anything happens to need to change, it would change here as well. And so this will be your kind of go-to to make sure you have the right dates. But we would encourage you, if you do happen to have to step out early or miss, that you do take advantage of the recording. Of course, as you know, that's our way of public record for us. All right, so that's kind of it on that end, and I'm gonna actually unshare and reshare, so all you get is the PowerPoint. Okie doke. Here's the statement piece. We're going to go through this quickly. The Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss the state's formula for funding public education. Before we begin, the department would like to remind you of the following. Conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in a new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula. All righty.
Thank you, Jamie, for doing that. So we've gone through the statement. We do have a very full agenda, and just kind of want to point out the goals of the committee. And we discussed at our last committee, and for those of y'all that can stay, for this to be a 90-minute meeting instead of a 60-minute meeting. And given the intensity and the full agenda, I think we'll probably need that 90 minutes. I think the goals of today's meeting will be just continue to discuss the rural student needs and the must-have, should-have, and start drilling that down in the Google Docs. Thank you, Sean, for taking a strong leadership position. Thank you, thank you, thank you, in creating this. Another one that is very time sensitive is, we've been talking about a superintendent survey, and I tried to take your all's comments and gel them down a little bit, but I'd like for us to take time because the department is going to do one superintendent survey because a lot of subcommittees are requesting this. So instead of getting multiple, it'll be a coordinated one. I just want to make sure we have highlighted in that survey for superintendents the items we feel like that are most important that we want to cover from our subcommittee. And then the other part that Jamie will lead us through is just the feedback collected by TDOE for comment and review, talking about high level, and then at the granular level, we'll need to talk about that process and what we need to do to be able to go through that feedback. Jamie, do we need to do a roll call, or do you have everyone's names?
Yep, I have them. I don't think I have anybody right now on a phone. So, yep, I'm good.
Okay. So just meeting follow-ups. I think Jamie and I are going to probably tag team this one, but on the friendly reminder page, which I think is next, just would like for us to make sure that we're not only putting resources into the Google document, but that we're also, when we're talking about everybody's expertise, that we're adding individual expertise into these Google Docs too, just based on your experience in the leadership roles that you're in your respective communities. And stakeholder engagement, a big part of that I just alluded to was the superintendent survey. We're going to take some time to look at that. I tried to summarize it based on what I've heard from you all, based on that longer one to consolidate it down. I'd like to at least be able to spend some time on that today because I really feel like it's time sensitive. We need to get those questions to the department so we're included in the overall survey. Jamie, I'm going to let you add to just this recap from the previous meeting, anything that we need to make sure we're following up on.
Yep, so the Google Drive that I just showed you, the question sets, any of the questions that subcommittees proposed, submitted, asked, or we sent up the flagpole, all of those were consolidated, and those documents and that resource links with the blue lines, those are intended to really support any of those questions. I'm going to go back while you all are getting started. I'm going to go back and look at our document to just ensure that there weren't any outlying questions that really would springboard today's conversation. I'm going to check on that as we go.
There is one that I feel like it's just we have such a full agenda and I don't want to forget it, so we probably need to get in the recording. There was some significant discussion about just definition of rural, and I think that there's a place for that we'll need to get back to. It just felt like there was a little much to put into today's agenda, but I think it's worth getting it into notes again so it doesn't get missed.
Actually, I have us an answer for that.
Okay.
Yep. So I'm going to let you go ahead and get started while I find it. And I'll just do us a little quick sidebar. And and let you know what that is. Give me a second to find it.
Okay. So feedback summary is from all of these meetings, the documents that Jamie just told us how to access. Just the general overview of this is there seems to be surfacing an overall trend, whether you're rural, suburban, whatever group that you're in, that seems to be bubbling to the surface. And you can see there on that screen that a lot of it is to make sure that the state funding isn't less than what we're already receiving, to maintain flexibility for local district budgeting, ensure that whatever is currently funded outside of BEP is included in a new formula. And, you know, it's right in front of you too, but that seems to be, in general, a lot of the feedback is putting that, is emphasizing that. There are 4 buckets: the base of what we're looking for, then the weighted, how much weighting each category goes into for the formula for funding, direct funding, and outcomes. And Jamie, I'm going to send this one to you because this section of the overall feedback is an area that I feel like we could use some guidance to walk us through on this feedback section. I know this is where we're going to spend a lot of our time. The other committees are spending a lot of their time, and I think it would be helpful for you to guide us through this, and we inject, and I will certainly do that.
All right. So as Janet was just saying, you know, the components of a student-based funding formula really do kind of fall into this pyramid. We think about the bottom layer of the pyramid being that base, which is really think about each student actually receives this level of funding. Then we move to weights, which is just that multiplier assigned to students based on an additional need, such as EL or SWD. We know there are many folks are starting to really get into conversations about weighting, and also lots of questions that have surfaced in the weighting conversation. Of course, direct funding, that's that dollar amount allocated to students based on specific programs. So that's really based on programming. And then outcomes are any of those additional dollars that we can allocate, based on really getting those stronger outcomes for traditionally higher needs student groups. So the following slides, you'll see base, weights, additional dollars, and outcomes. And the idea, I'm sorry if I'm making you dizzy here, the idea is that each of these, the top, there is just a quick definition of what we mean by that term. And then you're going to see a list of bulleted resources that have already surfaced trend level. Don't you think of it as trend level? Some of the conversations this week have really gotten down into the nitty gritty of what do we mean by counselors, for example. So I think it warrants some conversation with a group for sure, but just keep in mind that this is trend level. That more specific small grain size that I'm talking about, those are those individual comments. That's the feedback in your Google Drive. So this is high level trend data. At the very bottom of each of these slides is a prompt for the subcommittee to get us really thinking about this particular component of a student-based funding formula. For example, here you're going to see that we're going to talk about which ones would you support, maybe which ones would you not support, what would you add or change, or do you have any other considerations for the list that's bulleted right here. So that's kind of how this rolls. There, as I said, these 4 chunks are 4 following slides. But before we move on and really get into conversation, right down here at the bottom of this slide, you're going to see that it starts with the word requested and then a colon. So basically what this is loud and clear. These were 4 very, I guess I would say like loud and clear, loud and clear requests that came out of the feedback. Just a really prolific amount of feedback around these 4. So for example, the first one is districts should not receive less state funding than they receive through the current BEP. This subcommittee, along with all other subcommittees, have said it and said it and said it again. So again, not that it doesn't deserve airtime, but do know that that message has made it up the pipeline and is absolutely heard loud and clear. The second one here is maintain flexibility for local district budgeting. Again, not just the public comments, but even from subcommittees, we've definitely heard and value the amount of recommendation for flexibility there. The third one is ensure that whatever is currently funded outside of the BEP is included in a new funding formula. So that has definitely surfaced as well, particularly around, SROs and a lot of mental health supports. So again, just if it's outside of the BEP, can we currently outside of the BEP, can we include it in a new funding formula? Last but not least, lots of conversation around local match. I know you got an email regarding local conversations that are going to start happening actually starting next week. So the idea here is that the local match component should be stable. What it is currently under the BEP for the next 3 to 5 years. What that does is gives communities 3 to 5 year kind of runway to plan how they're going to manage and work with a local match. Rather than saying, here's a new funding formula, figure it out today, it does give communities that opportunity to think about planning ahead of time. So those were the 4, as I said earlier, kind of loud and clear. This definitely surfaced as big high-level trends out of that first batch of feedback. You will be receiving 2 more rounds of feedback. The first one will be the first week in January, and the next one will be January 17th. And so this first batch of feedback is not culled per subcommittee. So it was not sorted per subcommittee as we initially thought it would be. And that's primarily due to the fact that it was all saying the same stuff. And it was all saying such big, high level, important, those things that are near and dear to our heart, very close to our heart, that we feel so strongly about. Those were the things that surfaced that every subcommittee needs to hear and work through. So it at this point has not been culled. So I'll stop right there, and Janet, you pipe in and do what you need to, and then I'm going to put myself on mute.
Okay. So there's a lot of material, and it's pretty rapid fire. So I want to make sure that we take time and discuss these components as we go through slide by slide with our rural lens on. Just this first overview slide, just want to underscore that Tennessee is one of the few states that still uses this formula, and that the student-based formula, there's 28 states that are purely student-based, 10 that use a hybrid formula. I don't think we need to spend much more time on this slide, but I want to open up to the subcommittee members to see if there's anything on this slide. I mean, I think that captures certainly the sentiments that when we were first discussing that are we would even put in our must-have bucket. Yes, Eddie.
Thanks, Janet. I just wanted to, that third requested where it's talking about ensuring that whatever is funded outside the BEP is included in the new formula. I just want to be hesitant to make sure that this goes on record, because maybe I'm not presuming positive intent here, but I could see where if we have a base amount that we get right now based on our BEP funding formula, and if we take all of the extra stuff that we're getting now and roll that into the funding formula, it will look like there was an increase in how much the state is giving or how much we're spending per kid. And in actuality, it won't be. So I just want to make sure that we have out there that if they do roll those things in there, which I think they do, there needs to be a designation. We need to make sure we capture that, it went up, but it didn't go up. So I hope that it goes up, but in addition to those, rolling those in. But I just want to make sure that that's on the record.
I think that's a great clarity point, Eddie, because it goes into the other part of this conversation we keep talking about is transparency in the formula. And I think that's a great point that really sometimes makes the formula not as easy to interpret because of all of those add-ons. So that is a great point. Anything else on this slide we feel like that we need to get discussed before we move on to talking about the base?
I've seen where, and researching some of the other state models that we've talked about, Ohio and Indiana and some of these other places, that saw that Indiana or Ohio has a 5-year projection of what that might be, and if we were to move to a student-centered model or strategy for funding, that it might be a good thing to have that, to see what we're looking at over the next 3 to 5 years ahead of time, instead of just budget to budget when we start those so early before the next fiscal year starts. It'll be some kind of projection, so we can anticipate what we're looking at for our state funding portion and what our local funding bodies can also be looking at to plan ahead instead of waiting until the last minute.
I agree. Lillian, I think you're next.
Yes, thank you. I believe the districts may understand what they mean by this, but this maintain flexibility for local school district budgeting, what does that really mean? And if the districts are satisfied with that language, I'm unclear what we're really talking about. I think I get the spirit of it, but what do we really mean when we say flexibility for the district budgeting? Can someone agree with that?
I asked a question yesterday, whatever day it was, that we had our superintendent meeting, the day before maybe, with the commissioner about how the flexibility in our the way we spend money with districts would change under a student-centered model, because that was one of the things early on that was supposed to be kind of a positive, is the way I understood it. But Ms. Hargrove, what is our BEP formula is a funding formula, not a spending plan. So we do have flexibility. We get funding based on this formula, but we can spend it on however we deem our priorities are. And from what the commissioner said, that anything that's been discussed, or nothing's obviously been hashed out for sure, but did not think it be any less flexibility from my understanding, that we can, however we get this sum of money for each student, we're able to spend that on whatever priorities that we see fit in the district.
Thank you for clarifying that, and please call me Lillian. Thank
Sally,
you.
did I see you wanted to make a comment?
I think I took my hand back down. I was just, Christy said beautifully what, and much more articulately than what I could have said it. But yeah, we don't want to be tied into a spending plan when each district has its own context, and that's all I was going to add.
Okay. Any other comments on this slide? This is great feedback. Jamie, let's go to the next one, base. And, just, we've had these in advance. Take a minute to look over this, but I'd love to hear some comments. I made a couple of notes myself that I know that teacher salaries and benefits was something that we've talked about along with all of these other things. And so it's interesting this is coming up in the feedback, because it's certainly the areas that we talked about. But in all of the material we got, it's just a good reminder. Tennessee is the lowest average adjusted teacher salary in U.S. High-need rural areas are especially in need of support. And in Tennessee, 1 in 10 rural students changed residence in 2018. So this mobility rate also increases the need for a more wraparound. And we've all discussed about recruiting and retaining effective teachers in these rural spaces. And then rural Tennessee schools rank 7th in the lowest instructional spending per student. And the only reason I did that is I am very old school. I tried to print out all this material so I could take notes. Yes, I did fall asleep reading it multiple times, but those were some of the things that jumped out at me that I wanted to also get into the discussion. I value those that are out in the field and seeing this and doing it and running these districts. So the robustness comes from the ability to be there hands-on day to day and then articulate it to those of us that aren't doing it day to day, but are very interested in making sure that this rural space is protected in this process, and that we start to recognize some of these unique factors. So in looking at all that, please, let's just open it up. And I see Eddie's hand up again.
Yeah, thank you. I had one question, and Jamie, you may be able to answer this. I don't know, because in some of the resources that the departments put out and that we have on our Google Drive, I noticed, the amounts that some of the states have for their base level. And the question I have is that the total amount that comes from the state, or is, let's say it's 5,000 or 7,000, then does the state, or is that then it's a 70-30 split or whatever the local match is? That's a question that I was wondering, because that impacts significantly what we're looking at when we start talking about a base amount.
Yeah, actually, that was a question yesterday, and that I asked for some clarification too, because they were curious to know, is it state and local in a base? Is it just state? I'm going to look back and see if I have an answer for that one right now, because that changes everything.
Lillian, you have a question?
I do, and I'm going to ask some questions, but it's more important from my lens that the districts provide the information that's needed here. When I look at this, and I'm thinking there's some things that appear to be missing to me, and so my question to the group and to you all, to you, Janet, should we not be detailing more specifically what should go in this space besides these broad categories? And when I say that, I think about teacher salaries and benefits. Well, schools are also utilizing substitute teachers, and there are librarians, and there are other positions within the school system, and I'm not sure where we would be capturing that. The other thing, social workers. I know that schools have social workers today, and so I'm wondering about that, as well as the ratio of these individual positions that are listed. Nurses. What are we saying here? Are we saying nurses at the current ratio, or are we talking about nurses at the national average or national recommendation, and so on and so forth, with all of those other positions like counselors, school psychologists, etc. So the district leadership, their opinion is more important than mine, but I'm wondering if we don't put details here, as I just mentioned, will it not be included? Will those things not be included?
Lillian, I think that's a great question. So just a quick reminder that this is really high-level summary data. And so it is kind of the committee. So what this does is kind of springboard you into a conversation with your colleagues here to really think about, are there specifics? Do we narrow this down? Lots of the questions have been around exactly what you're saying. Are we talking academic counselors? Are we talking mental health counselors? Who are we talking about? So, which then leads you to a deeper, more intentional conversation around those highlighted trends right there. I did get an answer about state funding only, base is part of the pyramid, local funding lives outside of the pyramid.
Okay.
Does that help?
Jerry, you have a question? Comment?
Sure. It's just, and I realize that's not what we're looking at, and the base is not an exhaustive list, but I'm a little surprised, even though, this is statewide summary of feedback, that school leadership's not specifically called out there. I know teacher salaries, but I think we, don't argue the importance of the conversation and focusing on teacher salaries, but every school should have a principal, no matter what size, and they should be paid at a certain level at minimum. And I think it would be important to also include principal salaries separately from teacher salaries.
Terry, I was going to jump in there. I know Sean on his that that Google Drive that he's created where you've got the must have, should have, nice to have, and long shots. I think, if Jamie's wanting to kind of look and Lillian, that goes into a whole lot more detail. This is kind of an overview here, but that Google Drive that Sean created has a whole lot more detail. And that was one of the things that I put is right now in BEP, for every principal or assistant principal or supervisor you have, you get the same salary generated as a teacher. But in essence, those supervisors obviously have more responsibilities. They work extra months, but yet we only get the amount of money that we get for a teacher. So I think that needs to be reflected in the base also.
Being someone that Norma, go ahead.
I think we have to also take into consideration here, like Jerry said, with principals, assistant principals, and those who evaluate teachers. We're required under statute to evaluate teachers according to the team model or Tiger model or whichever model that district has adopted. And at the rate we are funded for administrators in BEP, there's no way that law can be followed if we only have the amount of administrators that BEP would fund. So we've got some competing priorities there. So I think it might even be that we need to think about funding at the rate that is required by statute for evaluating teachers.
I want to ask or say something here because I feel like I'm a step removed from being at that district. So this really helps me. I mean, I need to hear what's happening there to be able to do it. But when I was making notes, and I apologize, this is a note format. So it's semi-questioning to the group and just my thinking process when I'm going through it. Because I don't live this every day. So when I think of base, I think about, moving from a student-based formula. I feel like for a rural community, a base would be what uniquely for a base for a subcommittee that's rural is what is that base amount that kind of encompasses all these things? Because I agree that we need to understand what all these things are. But when I was looking at it, it felt more like to me, from the perspective I sit at and just push back and help me think through this process, that while we're exploring this rural weight and looking at a base, that the challenges facing rural communities, like harder to attract or retain effective educators, less economies of scale to provide advanced coursework, the unique wraparound services that we need, which takes into like the school psychologists and counselors and nurses, things like grow your own, because we talked about that. I specifically wrote that in my notes because I think that was in our first committee meeting. Teacher evaluation and leadership items, to your point, Nora, about those. Is there a way to take, when you're looking at base, all of those things that make the weight for the base of a rural student this because of the unique challenges, and then you start adding the weights on top of them so that you already start with the different base because of the uniqueness of rural that encompasses all those things about economies of scale and training and recruiting and attracting and leadership and the unique needs of wraparound services. I don't even know if I'm articulating that well. Eddie, you jumped in there, so maybe you can help me get that out better. You're on mute.
I don't know if this is correct, but the way I see this happening or the way I understand it, the base would be, this is what you would need for every school, for every student, and that's, what goes into that would be, cafeteria, you've got to have cafeteria, you've got to have secretaries, you've got to have all those transportation curriculum, you've got to have all that for them. But then looking at some of the feedback and some of the other states or the way they do it with rural being weighted, whether that's a 1.9 or a 2.0 or whatever that might be, for every student that you have, you would get additional funds for them being rural. And those would kind of be the multipliers that would go in there. So I don't think the base for rural students would be different. You would just have the base for everybody, and then that weight would be added on to that student so that rural schools, rural districts would get additional funding for every student that.
And I may have jumped ahead of us. I mean, so that kind of leads us next to the weight slide, which comes next. But I think, Lillian, you had your hand up, and then Sean.
Actually, I was going to say what Eddie said, so you can move on to Sean. Thank you.
Okay.
And everyone's thinking alike, because that was the point that I think needed to be made, that there's a couple of other, I mean, the base is there, but there's a couple of other points to make. And I steal these things from other places, so don't think that it was my original idea, but there's two different kinds of weight. You don't need to say that there's just a rural and small school weighting, because that itself, we talked about the challenges that brings. But there's also a second level of weight that should be considered, and that's for the economically disadvantaged and the concentration of poverty. Just because you're rural doesn't mean that your district has a high population of ED or students that are at high risk. And so I think, in some ways districts could be penalized, if you're just given a rural multiplier, but you still have all of these students that require all these wraparound and extra services. And so I think we need to be looking at it, from two different buckets: the rural multiplier, and then the ED and concentration of poverty, which would also not just be rural, but would serve students across all districts that, come from those backgrounds.
Those are on my notes, Sean, from the next slide, which is weights. So any more comments on base, or it feels like, I've got William?
Absolutely. I agree with Eddie and certainly with Sean and Christy Ball. And that is, the number of schools I think should be included in any base. I have 7 campuses, and I only have 2,000 some odd students. So I think the number of schools that you have is a very critical component of any base that we would consider, is an actual number of schools.
And I'm sorry, I just want to jump in there and say, Freddie, I appreciate you bringing it up, because I haven't thought about that in this context, but I've used the example many times, and I'm not throwing any of my colleagues under the bus, but I have a county just to the north of us that has almost an identical student population, and they have 4 schools and we have 7. And because of the geography of our county and being rural, we really couldn't operate with 4 schools. So, we need those 7, but we're not funded the same way they are because they only have 4. And I think that's a really good point.
And having the number of schools, I think, is relatively to geographic too. I think somewhere in this process, there should be a geographic factor, Sean, that my county is spread out a little bit more, but yet I've got 7 schools, and we're looking at consolidation, absolutely. But we're looking at that and doing that. I've got to have the infrastructure. So the number of schools I have, example, principals, Chairman Ayers, if I look at my principals, I'm only paid for, I have 7 schools, but I'm only paid for about 4.5 principals. So that has to be done that has to be funded at the local level. And I know that was a local decision to have 7 schools. I understand that. However, that's the situation that I am faced with, that I'm underfunded before the game even begins. That I am, and I have a very reluctant commission. I don't want to spend an hour talking about that, which I could, but I'm just telling everybody that I think the number of schools should be in there. Thank you, Chairman Ayers.
Thanks. Sean?
No, I'm good. I don't know if I have my hand up or not. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. I think we've moved ourselves into the next slide of weights. So if you want to look at that a minute, and we'll start commenting on weights. Again, this is high level, the feedback that and Sean, to your point, this captures the economically disadvantaged, and we start talking about sparsity in the different categories. And I know in looking at the material, sparsity and rural are kind of interchangeable in the material that we were provided. There are 34 states that have some kind of weighting for either sparsity or rural, whichever one they term that they use. And there were several examples. Georgia, Louisiana, California had some examples about sparsity. But what I really want to do is for y'all to look at it and let's open it up and start discussing weights, because I feel like this is where we really start getting into the uniqueness of the rural communities and the things that we feel like to need to be the weighting and the add-ons to the base.
I'm going to give, excuse me, Jane, I'm going to give a quick definition. So as you review these, it helps a little bit. So rural refers to the federal definition of being within so many miles or falls within a defined circumference of a large city center. So it's the federal definition. And then sparsity is refers to how the population is dispersed across the area. So of course it creates more transportation challenges and costs. It can be part of rural areas, but it's not the same as being rural. So maybe that helps out a little bit as you dig through.
Eddie?
Yeah, on the, I put a question in the chat box. I assume that if you have a student that hits multiple weights or categories, that those would add, that they would add together, that you don't get the greater of one. Is that correct, Jamie?
As far as I understand it, that it has been a question that other subcommittees have surfaced, like, can we stack? Can we stack weights? Yeah, that has definitely surfaced this week. And particularly, I mean, if we think of the word multiplier, you know, that definitely gives it that connotation. So we're working to get some clarification there too.
And then the last thing, when we talk about rurality, is that going to be defined based on the school, or is that based on the district? Because you could have, you know, the district as a whole might be rural, but you might have some schools that would be and some schools that would not qualify.
Yep, great question. Great question.
And I think that's one of the questions that we might want to, in our survey for superintendents as well. Freddie, sorry I called you William before.
Oh, good time. I knew I was in trouble if my mama said William Freddie. I knew I was in big trouble.
Well, I'll try not to say the two together then.
No problem. No problem. I've probably been called a lot worse by many people as a director. But let me just say this in regard to into weighting. Is I think physical capacity has to be one of those weights. And Jamie, they may have talked about that in some other committees, but physical capacity of your system, I think, should be there, because you know, I keep comparing myself to next door, but it's true, is Rutherford County's fiscal capacity, particularly at sales tax, is a whole lot more than what my fiscal capacity is here in Cannon County. And I may or may not meet the definition of rural because I am next door. However, we're very rural. But I think physical capacity should be a weight, or because I will tell you this, in my county, whatever the state, if the state were to increase by, let's say 15% from one of the categories in the BEP, if it went from 75 to 85, my county commission would diametrically oppose that, and I wouldn't get, you know, because the state is now paying, I would not get that 15% more. It would be, they would deduct it from that physical capacity. So I really believe physical capacity should be one of the weights that should be figured. You can do the Tasser model or any of the other models, but I'm just saying physical capacity needs to be there. Thank you.
Christy?
I think CTE needs to be there. It's really expensive for us to run programs for, you know, shops and, you know, if I wanted to do an HVAC or I wanted to do an auto body repair, you know, courses and things like that, it's really tough for us to do those on our campuses. And so I think CTE should be weighted. It's not on this list, I don't believe, or in the secondary list there in that next sentence. I don't think that's there. So I think if we could add that, would be great.
Hey, Christy, it is in the programmatic one here, or it's middle school CTE, and then innovative high school models. Is there anything specific as far as weighted other than programmatic that you're really thinking?
No, I think the other part would be if we're taking our students. I've seen where some states have what they're calling service centers, where they kind of consolidate resources together to have different programs and things. I mean, I think that would probably be included in a transportation portion or something if we had to take our students somewhere else. So that probably would fit in a different category. Thank you.
Sure.
Eddie?
Yeah, when she mentioned about the innovative, I want to echo, I've got an innovative high school grant, and I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but the things that we've been able to do with that money to hire additional personnel, the opportunities that our kids have, I mean, this is a direct need in our state that we're able to work on partnerships with workforce, industry, and be able to have students that can adjust their high school schedules and go right into the workforce. I mean, we shouldn't have to have a grant to be able to do that. You know, those are things that we should be able to do on a yearly basis without having to write a long grant, and only so many people in the state get the opportunity to do it. Every child in the state of Tennessee needs that opportunity. And I just want to say that that's sorely needed and definitely needs to be thought of as we look at funding. And then K2, it hasn't gotten much mention. In high school, those two areas are very difficult and needs weights to be able to do the job. Because if we don't do what we need to do at the K2 area, we're trying to catch it, and we won't be able to catch what we miss out on. So money spent initially will pay dividends, so that we're not having to spend all the money on interventions and stuff.
Freddie, I think you had some other comment or question.
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Sean?
Yeah, I put this in the chat, and I don't know if I can make this make sense, but we're assuming that, you know, all of us would be categorized as rural school districts. But I think the definition for how that's determined could impact our funding significantly. So right now, we know what the qualifiers are for economically disadvantaged. And I'm not saying that anyone would ever do this, but if the state wanted to decrease the amount of school funding, they just decrease or just change the definition of rural or the definition of ED. And, you know, then all of these multipliers we're getting suddenly goes away. So I think there's got to be some kind of definition of what ED is, what it will remain, at least for the coming future, what rural is, what sparsity looks like. And we have to have those in concrete before we can really start talking about dollars and cents and weights of funding.
Let me ask a question. If we were going to ensure the rural students' needs are met, am I hearing that some of the non-negotiables would be sparsity and economically disadvantaged would be in the must-haves on our weighting?
I think when you talk about sparsity, that's different than, I think that's important to take into consideration. And I think about over in East Tennessee, where you might have a K-8 school of 100 kids, but you don't have an option to consolidate that. You have to do that. I mean, but then I think about some of my schools that might be K-8 and you've got 100, 120 kids. It's different. And so I think that has to be in there.
Just floating it out there. Some of the material we were given, we had some examples of some different states that have sparsity in the consideration. Georgia provides grants for geographically isolated schools. California has something that's the necessary small school allowance. Tennessee, Oklahoma, and Ohio have something for transportation. Of course, I starred the one Louisiana, where it has small districts are eligible for student weights between 1.0 and 1.2, just on top of the base. Just, at some point, I want us to be able to take these conversations and start building into the must-have, should-haves, like-to-have category. So as we discuss this, when we go back to our Google Doc, I think it'll be helpful for us to start plugging in, on a non-negotiable and must-have in the weighting. What do you all consider would have to be the must-have? And then I guess my other question would be, how many weights do you think we need to have in the funding formula for the rural schools? I'm hearing economically disadvantaged, sparsity, but we also have things like special education, English learners, concentrated poverty, I think, is a big one. And these are all showing up here. And then there's charter that's listed in here, and we've not really talked about those. And so I think we need to start figuring out what things of this weighting do we want to prioritize and put into our must-haves, should-haves category. I don't know if that, Norma?
Something that was mentioned that is currently in the BEP that I had not thought about, was mentioned at our meeting this week, is the number of students per teacher. We have weights now or numbers where we can only have so many students per teacher, and that's in the BEP formula. But if this changes and that goes away, we could be setting ourselves up for failure. So I think that's something we don't need to forget about as we're going through this, that those class sizes are tied to that formula, from my understanding, and somebody correct me there if I'm wrong. And we can't have 27 first graders in a classroom and expect them to learn to read. So I don't know where that fits, but it's something that we really need to make sure that we're not overlooking.
Nora, I just highlighted it on the slide. Can you see that? So that was one of the things that did surface. It didn't receive as much feedback as the bulleted list above it. However, these are considered for weights. So if you think about the ones that actually bubbled to the surface most, these are the ones kind of right underneath that. And K2 small class size definitely was one of those, but correct me if I'm wrong as I'm taking notes. Are you saying K2 or are you saying class size holistically?
I'm saying class size holistically.
Okay, I got it.
Because some of the states that we are looking at don't have a cap on class sizes in this new funding formula, and that could be detrimental as well.
Sean, do you have a question?
Did I leave my hand up again? Yeah, I think I did, but I will make a comment to that because I think it's really important. Are we going to talk about case size, small class size weight for the entire state for every school? Or is that something that falls more in that concentration of poverty, needing a low class size ratio in early grades because of the services needed to catch those kids up? In my experience over time, we've tried to keep our class size ratios low, and we have. We're have averaged probably a 1 to 15 ratio for several years in K2 because we felt like that's important. But some superintendents I talk to in more maybe affluent areas don't feel like that's a need for them. So I think it's something, I don't know if we wanted to poll superintendents across the state. Is that a priority for you? But if not, I think that would fit right into the reason for the need for the economically disadvantaged and concentration of poverty weighting as a factor.
In listening, the concentration of poverty to me seems to encompass a lot of that class size or whatever, because it supports the fact that that concentration of poverty, economically disadvantaged, those students are going to need more tutoring. They're going to need extended learning. Their wraparound services, their non-academic supports seem to be a significant piece when you're talking about concentrated poverty. And quite candidly, concentrated poverty doesn't just apply to a rural space, but it certainly exacerbates sparsity and economic. I mean, you know, these are things that can be in everywhere. It's just that sparsity piece of this and this on top of it. And I think somebody put this in the chat. Are each one of these weights an add-on to that base? I mean, for each thing we identify, like if we identified 6 different weighting measures of, and I'm just asking the question, Jamie, of concentrated poverty, economically disadvantaged, EL. I mean,
Yep. So
that's added on top. These weights are added to the base, each one of them.
Yep. And so if you look at this one, the weight multiplier assigned to students based on an additional needs identified. So, it's kind of one of those things that he asked about earlier. And I have put in the question set, is there a discrepancy, or I guess what I think it's more about, is there an opportunity for students to fall into multiple weighted categories and then those multiply, or are we actually looking at the greater of 2 or 3? I think we just need some clarity there, but it is in addition to the base. Yes.
Well, Jamie, one thing I'll throw out there, if we have a student that is economically disadvantaged and special ed and BHN, for accountability, they count for all 3. So I think if we're going to have multipliers, then if they're one, then and another one, they need to be added together.
Great point. Anything else on weighting? I think, Christy, go ahead.
Do we have any information on what, I haven't seen that in other state models, but I have, I've read a lot of things, but if I have, I don't recall a charter school enrollment weighted category. Do we have any information on that? What that might look like, or what?
Christy, you want an example?
Yes, I'm just curious. I haven't seen that one on another state one. If I have, I just haven't noticed it.
Okay. I'll see if we have one.
Before they might do that. And then I did want to, because of that, I know that we're the rural and small school subcommittee, but I did want to make mention about the states that went to student centered. There have been, it seems like several like online schools, public schools, or online charter schools that don't cost as much to do that by far, if it's just online curriculum and online teachers and that type of thing. So I was just curious about maybe that too. I don't know what that could look like, or if some of the things that, if you're not providing a physical learning environment and all of the services that a traditional school would, it just seems like it wouldn't be as much. I just want to make that comment. And then I would like a little bit of clarification on a charter enrollment weight, just because I haven't seen it. Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. Anything else on this slide? Y'all want to move to additional dollars? The next slide.
Janet, one thing, I'm just throwing something out there. I don't know that anybody would want to do this, but we have when we think about weights, we think of like a 1.4 or one, that additional money. I guess if you've got, an online or whatever, you could have a weight where it could be a 0.75 or something like that, where it doesn't cost as much. That could go in there. I'm just throwing that out there.
Other comments? This is great discussion and very helpful to help us really drill down on what we're ultimately going to pull together for our list to submit. Christy, you have another comment?
One more is that I think that the amount of weight, when we're talking like 1.5 or 2.0 or whatever that may be, that highly depends on the base. I mean, in some of the states where the base is $3,000, the weights might be a lot. The weighted amount is a lot more. And then in states where the base is $8,000 or $10,000, then the weighted amounts for those extra categories of students might not be quite as much, because you started out with more to start with. So I think that base amount is really important when we start determining a point this amount above the base. I mean, that matters. Those dollars will be significantly more if the base is higher. So.
I want to make sure we capture all of the chats and then we'll go into the slide. Freddie, I think you added a comment about direct certification is counted where parents, guardians that fill out free reduced forms and qualify are not factored into the count of economically disadvantaged. Not being somebody that's right in the district, knowing all those things, I want to make sure we capture, which we have been, but I think that's an important part to put into the comments about weighting and the definitions and the importance of getting clear definitions so that you think you have it covered and definitions change and it's no longer covered. So I think we need to make sure we capture that comment. Anything else? Additional dollars, we've talked about some of these, the CTE. We've really not talked about the tutoring and some of these other things. So I'm gonna open up on additional dollars, but things I didn't see there that had bubbled up, and I know this had come before, is, you know, there's fewer higher education facilities in these areas. So, or just, there's a lot of economies of scale that you aren't getting in these spaces. So I think some of those things, limited internet and broadband, less economic growth, teacher shortages, limited funding for high quality early childhood and transportation. I don't know that we've captured those anywhere else. And I wrote those down because those had come back from one of our earlier meetings. And I'm just trying to make sure for continuity that I'm capturing everything that's been said before so that it continues to flow up and into these conversations. I know this is feedback from that we're getting through the department, but I felt like those points that you all as subcommittee members that had put out there needs to be in the conversation for additional dollars as well. I mean, I do think some of the rural and the base and some of these weighting will help, but I don't want to lose those in the conversation. Eddie?
Thank you. I want to say in regards to a lot of these RTI, the tutoring and summer programming, many of these things are required legislatively. So we actually have, law that we have to follow. And, I know our senator and representative that's on here, we appreciate them with all their support, but it's a whole lot easier to do those things when there's funding that follows those requirements. So I think those need to be included for sure.
Other comments or questions about additional dollars to make sure that we've talked about base, we've talked about the weighting, but those other things that we've not captured.
Can you all see the highlighting on the screen? Can you see the blue?
It's
okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So those are examples of existing funding that would be applied to this category. So curious to know if there is anything else you'd add there, particularly in the last few years with Eddie, as you were saying, it there are things that we have to get grants for, and anything you'd add to that list.
Sean? And then Lillian.
Sorry. Yeah, this may be way out there, but I was just thinking about recently, we try to take funds and use them. We all obviously have to prioritize funds, but we've not given enough attention to our fine arts programs, and particularly in low income and rural areas, there's some challenges to kids being able to access some of the fine arts just because of the cost of band equipment and things like that. We were lucky enough to get a grant and to get some surplus stuff from the state, but is there an opportunity to do some outside of, and this is, we put this on the nice to have list or whatever, but are there ways for the state to help us, especially in rural areas, fund fine arts and social programs like athletics and other things that would give kids something to engage in. And I think, we watch as our community gets poorer, and we're losing population. We see the number of kids interested and able to participate in our band programs, and they've gone down tremendously. And so we're working hard to try to get those back up. Just kind of a pie in the sky kind of thing, but it's something that's important to our communities.
I think that's really important, because if we think about the buckets that we have to sort and categorize into, I mean, when we go to General Assembly with the recommendations, one of the things that, the commissioner has definitely continued to say is that if everything's in the must-have and the should-have buckets, and then we hear that things have to get cut out of these recommendations, then they don't have anything to say, oh, but don't cut that. So if it's the long shot bucket that if they have to cut, that's a place to cut, right? So not in the things that we know at our core must be in a funding formula, or really definitely should be in a funding formula. So those types of things, I think it's still great to start including those, start thinking about those bottom two buckets.
Great point. Lillian?
So my comment is really regarding, Janet, you mentioned other items that are not on this list, and I heard transportation, and I was thinking that transportation was going to be in the base funding, and perhaps that's off base for me to even say that. And I also thought that RTI might be included, but again, we didn't drill down. We said we didn't need to do that at this juncture. But is it correct then to say, let's take the items that are on this list and those that you already mentioned too, Janet, and have those and bucketize them in the category of must have, should have, nice to have, or I can't remember all the categories, but I know long shot is one of them. So is that what you would expect us to do with this particular category that's listed here? Put them where we believe they should go, rate them in importance, because I want to be sure that I'm doing what I'm expected to do as a member of the committee. Thank you.
And me as well, Lillian. And I think I guess maybe that's what I was asking, is that I haven't seen those specifically identified in these. And so I want to make sure they don't get lost. So I think it is a great opportunity, to Sean's point, even about the fine arts programs, that we do need to start determining what buckets these need to go into, and start taking what's in these slide decks. We've got the Google Doc, start putting them, each person contributing where they think they need to be, so we can flesh this out of the must-have, should-haves, nice-to-have, and long shots. So that's what feels organic or coming out of this to me, but I welcome if somebody's interpreting that differently.
And as a subcommittee, you are, absolutely welcome to do that right here. Yeah, I definitely feel comfortable to initiate the conversation around one of these and say, how do we feel about it? The document that I'm working from right now already has those buckets. And so I'm placing, as we discussed as well, as suggested, recommended placement.
Jamie, and you do have access to that list that Sean created, right?
I believe I do.
Okay, all right.
Sean, if I do not, I will let you know.
Is the pleasure of the subcommittee to maybe start just putting this in the Google Doc and sharing back and forth robustly? Because we've got between now and January, if we need to, I know holidays sometimes are hard to get everybody together, but if we need to, this Google Doc, I think it needs to probably become a lot more active on the must-have, should-have categories. And I think these bullet points are a good place to start filling in where we feel like they should be going based on your own expertise.
If I could say something, I appreciate that, because I think that's the intent here. And one of the things I think maybe had talked about last time, or maybe I dreamed this, but that we would go in and we would start filling in that document, and many of you have added several things there, but then that we would come up with a way for subcommittee participants to gather feedback, maybe through the survey or whatever, and then go in and rank the ones. If we think that's where it needs to stay, and the must-have, and a majority of the subcommittee feels like this is a must-have item, then we leave it there. And then we'll come up with a system or procedure for how we would rank each item, whether it should stay or go or move to a different category. Does that feel right to everyone?
Yes, but I clarification, and I know I missed the last meeting and I did listen to the recording, but just clarification. So when we bucketize these as must have, should have, et cetera, did you also include in that document, Sean, that we think this should go in the base as opposed to the weighted category or direct? So I apologize because I've not looked at that yet.
No, that I don't think we mentioned that, but that's a very good point. And so if you, I mean, if that's okay with the group, I'll go down now and just add a category for base. So the things we think should go in the base, like RTI and the things that have been, funded previously with, obviously under BEP or things that are, base, but I'll add that if that works for everyone. I'll put that in the bottom of the document.
Okay, thank you, Sean, again, for taking the lead on that. Does that feel comfortable to everyone else? Feels
Jen,
like an expeditious way to do it.
I was trying to think of how to, without a vote or whatever, it's possible. And I just want to throw it out to the group is if you're reading through that Google Doc and you see one that you don't agree with, then maybe you could highlight it. So then we know when we come back at the next meeting, the ones that we have highlighted, we need to have a discussion in our meeting. But if everybody's good with it, then we move forward. If not, then we can have that discussion about the ones that we have questions about.
Sounds good. And I don't know about you all, but I'm going to make a point of listening to, even though we're here participating, because we're covering so much material. Before I get into that Google Doc, I want to make sure we write down and capture everything from today. I know Jamie's taking notes, but there's great conversation that I don't want to get lost when we're trying to remember this and put in that Google Doc. Anything else on the additional dollar slide? Do y'all want to go ahead and move to the outcomes slide? We've got 13 minutes left, and I do want us to do a little work on the surveys just so we can get it to the department. I don't want that survey to go out without our input in that survey. Outcomes, I think this is an opportunity to be creative and see what things might already be out there. I'm going to open it up for discussion. The only thing I want to say about outcomes, just from my perspective, I want this to be an opportunity to be looked at growth and improvement. And I don't want outcomes to be something that exacerbates an already existing difference. So I'd like to make sure that the way that we address outcomes is something that shows growth and improvements in outcomes, not just emphasizing all the things that make it hard in a rural space. I'd like to move past that.
Yeah, I agree with you, Janet. This one probably causes me the most heartburn of any of them, just because our districts are in so different, that it wouldn't be fair to compare the reading proficiency of Gibson County Special School District with that of another, district, just because of the different demographics. And, so I think growth needs to be very important when we're talking about outcomes, because we have, we get growth in our accountability model. Now we may not all agree with how that's figured, but you can get value added for your ED. You can get the value added scores, which measures growth for all of those, typically the underserved subgroups. So I think that would be something that needs to be considered.
Sean?
Yeah, and so I guess maybe I'm trying to understand what we're really talking about here with outcomes. I mean, like we don't get funding if we don't meet a certain metric. I mean, what about if we? I mean, I assume that's what we're talking about here. But what if there was some incentive? You know, like there was an incentive pool of funds for school districts, because I mean, we have done very well with EPSOs. I mean, that's a target we hit, a number we hit, and if we're doing good work there, would there be an opportunity for the district to receive incentive funds for doing good work as opposed to being penalized for something?
Like a bonus program rather than not a base program, but a bonus program.
Yes. To give, targets and metrics to hit. I mean, we already have accountability and we have to hit a lot of these targets, but if districts are doing exceptional work, then maybe reward them and incentivize them for hitting a certain target for EPSOs or for AP course completion.
Again, don't shoot me because I know just enough to say the word and a little bit about it. Are there things that exist out there so you don't have to create a new system? Is Ready Graduate something that we can build on?
Yeah, Ready Graduate is one of our accountability indicators. I mean, we have a target that we're tracked there, and there are a lot of different metrics go into what creates a Ready Graduate. And all of these things can be counted toward that. But I guess my thought is I just don't know where we're headed with outcomes-based funding. As Eddie mentioned, every district being so different. So the growth would be really important. But again, setting a threshold or a bar that if districts are meeting this or exceeding this, there's some incentive funds to continue that work or to improve on that work. I don't know. Jerry,
you had a question?
Not a question. I was just gonna build off of what Sean's brought up too. I think if we're gonna do an outcomes-based funding thought, the idea of an incentive and I know it means different things to us when we hear value added, but a value add to a school system for exceeding, meeting or exceeding some goals. Maybe there's a conversation around there's a choice that districts make about the goals that they're going to pursue, and if they meet those goals or exceed those goals, then there's some monetary bonus or incentive to exceed. We always want to exceed our goals, but as Sean pointed out, we have a lot of things defined for us, basically, so we meet expectations and avoid losing autonomy as a school system. So if we're going to push forward some kind of concept outcomes-based funding, I think it should be viewed as an incentive, not a penalty. We already have plenty of opportunities to face penalties.
Yeah, from a 40,000 foot level, it feels more like incentive or bonus feels right, as opposed to it feeling punitive. And I hate that outcomes ever got affiliated with that thought process.
Agree.
But want to be protective of that too. Other comments on this slide?
I think the only thing to clarify is what is really meant by this. So what is the administration thinking, or anybody else who will ultimately draft the final legislation? What does this mean? Is it meant to be punitive? Is it meant to be an incentive? I think we need to know that. I think we need to understand that to several points that have already been made. So thank you.
Thank you, Lillian. Other comments on this slide? I guess we'll move to the next slide on discussion.
So actually this slide in here is really to prompt you to start thinking about the 4 buckets, but actually you already have.
Yes.
those along the way. So this doesn't make a whole lot of sense here for this subcommittee. So if it's all right with you all, I have dropped the notes that I have taken into the chat. And if you'll take a few moments to just look over those, I'm going to go ahead and put outcomes in. It's the only one I haven't done yet. And just double check that I actually did capture the, the heart of what you're trying to say. And if I need to shift something, edit, omit, add, just let me know. We'll take just a few moments to read through those. Give me a thumbs up when you've worked through them, and if you feel like they accurately represent your discussion today. Looks like most people are about done. Anybody still reading? Thank you, Norma. Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Freddie. All right, wonderful. Janet, I will actually send this document to you like normal, just for approval. If you'll just, I'll email it to you and you'll email it back. Then once we have that approval on our end, then I'll send on up. So just as a subcommittee, know that that's what happens with this afterwards. These are suggestions and notes, not formal recommendations.
And because we clearly needed the whole 90 minutes and we did not get to the superintendent survey. I really do not want that survey to go out without an opportunity for the rural piece of that to be reflected in that survey. Is that something that we could, today is Thursday. Jamie, how long do we have in order to be able to get from our group to be included in that survey?
I don't know a timeline. I haven't heard of one yet. I do know that, TOS is working with the department to really shake that one out. So let me double check. I'll get to you and you can send that out to the committee. And
is the committee comfortable with us just doing just working on through Google Doc, just that survey? There's a summary to start providing feedback, not only on the must-haves and the should-haves, but let's drill down so we can get an agreed upon set of questions for this survey so that we can be included in the master superintendent survey that the department is going to do. Is everybody comfortable with taking that approach? I don't want that to slip through and us not have a voice in that survey. Any other comments? I think we've got survey work to do, and I think then we really just need to highlight the must-have, should-have, starting to really drill down on that Google Doc and getting a lot more specific and putting things in categories over the next week or two. I know it's a minute. John, go ahead.
Trying to make sure I'm on. I just wanted, I know this is probably Captain Obvious statement, but as we build in more complexity, think through the administrative costs within the department, but also within your LEA on what it takes to get any additional weights, additional dollars, and that sort of thing.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. That's needs to be in the back of our thinking as we're going through this process. Do you have a question or a comment, Jerry? That might be an old hand holding that he's got up.
Yeah, sorry. I didn't take my hand down.
Okay. Well, if y'all are comfortable with that, there will be, we'll definitely be spending some robust time on getting through our Google Docs, the superintendent survey, and getting more concise with our must-have, should-haves, nice-to-have, and long shots. It's a lot in 90 minutes. Thank you all for amazing conversation and robust dialogue that will help inform this process up. I feel like when we get to the end of the process, I feel very confident that this subcommittee, the thoughtfulness that you all bring to this is greatly appreciated, and we should have some very thorough recommendations. We know that we can't determine the outcome and not all things will be included, but I know that they'll be well thought out, and I feel like these rural communities are definitely having a strong voice with you all on this subcommittee. Any final comments? It's 101 here, 201 in East Tennessee, Jerry and Jamie.
Except to say thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thanks you all. We'll
The
be
next
talking. Bye-bye.
meeting is up January 6th. That's our next meeting. We're really excited to see everybody. And in between, if you have questions, thoughts, comments, please don't hesitate to reach out either to Janet or to me. And don't forget tn.edu.funding email. Have folks between now and January hit the street and get people to submit their comments.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, everyone.
Merry
Thanks for
Christmas.
listening. Oh yeah, Merry Christmas.
2022.
Happy New Year.
Bye, you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Janet, your email is coming right now for your approval.
Okay, thanks, Jamie.
Great job today.
Thank you.